She'd been sleeping at the far end of the platform for 2 years. But that night, when the rain came hard enough to wash the city's color away, she stared straight at him and didn't look away. The sentence arrives like a small, cold stone dropped into still water. It makes a sound that rings after the first wave. It is the kind of first line that presses into the ribs and does not let go. It tells you 2 things at once. This is not new, and this is about to change. The station itself felt tired in the way old songs feel tired. Not broken, not dramatic, just used. The lights hummed overhead, a low, steady hum that could be counted, on like an old neighbor's night radio. The tiles were smudged with grime and coffee rings and the faint, stubborn ghosts of lipstick. On weekdays, the fluorescent lights made the place flat and efficient. On nights like this, when the trains thinned and the announcements were only a distant, sleepy echo, the platform held on to an intimate kind of loneliness. The wind found the place beneath the awnings and carried it through the racks of iron seats, and the sound of the rails was a low, patient pulse. She sat on the same cold tile at the platform's far end. A small, precise animal, like a punctuation, mark someone had left behind. She had lived there through 2 winters and 2 blunted summers, through a city's muted festivals and the quiet breakup of seasons. People who moved quickly, students, late-shift office workers, someone hurrying with the weight of grocery bags, didn't notice her. People who looked up for their trains sometimes caught her in the corner of their eye and felt that soft, electric tug, an almost sad curiosity. And then the train arrived and swallowed their attention. But other people noticed. The postal carrier who came on Tuesday mornings would leave a crust of bread at the trash bins. The night watchman sometimes tucked a paper cup of milk behind a column. A teenager once slipped her a tuna packet, and then stopped smiling for a week because she felt a shame he couldn't name. Her fur was the kind of gray that reads as 2 colors when the light changes, stone and smoke, with a lone patch of white like a single snowflake on the throat. Her eyes were the kind of green that is at once cautious and incandescent, like a small street lamp being careful not to announce itself. They were always open, measuring, patient. She did not come rushing when people offered food. She did not throw herself into laps. She lived like someone who remembers being loved and knows how easy it is to lose that map. She lived like someone with a schedule, a secret calendar only she could read. The human in this story, Maya, worked nights at the cafe across from the station. She had been there long enough to iron the same patience into her face, to learn where the espresso hissed, and when the pastries would be stale. She liked night work because it let the rest of her life be small and manageable. 1 job, 2 stops on the subway, a narrow apartment that smelled faintly of lemon and old books. People assumed night workers were invulnerable to loneliness because they were always busy, but that wasn't true. The quiet arrives any hour it likes. It walks in, sits down beside you, and talks in the voice of small, ordinary losses. An unfinished call, a birthday you don't answer, the way a sweater no longer fits the shoulder you remember it fitting. Maya had been carrying a weight that did not have a name. It was not public. It did not belong to a funeral or a headline. It was made of smaller things. The tossed-away habit of someone you loved, a map of friends who gradually moved to other cities, a job that left most nights empty in the spaces between orders. Addiction to small silences had become a domestic hobby for her. She had been hollowed with gentle things that make a person quieter, and then make that quiet feel like shelter. She would tell herself she had chosen this, and in some ways she had. Choosing a smaller life is still choosing, but sometimes when the choice stays long enough, you begin to feel like its consequence is the only thing that knows your name. The cat watched Maya the first night she noticed her. She watched like a tenant watches the person who comes to collect rent. Not hostile, not eager, just appraising whether this one will be steady. Maya was carrying a mug that had a chip on its rim, something sentimental that had been given at a time when she could believe in fixed things. The mug steamed in the air, the steam a small ghost that rose and thinned. She had stayed late that night because the bus of people had thinned out, and the manager had handed her the keys and said, "You're good, close up whenever." And there was a raw, soft relief in being allowed to linger in the leftover quiet. She found the cat because her route home took her past the platform. The platform was a slice of the city that she passed in the pause between the world she made at work and the narrower world she returned to each morning. She would come to the platform and watch the trains and sometimes, without intending to, notice the small things that did not belong to anybody. That particular night the rain had come down heavy enough to blur the station's neon into a long watercolor smear, and the air smelled like the copper tang after a storm. The cat sat under the awning, slight and saturated, eyes like coins. The first line of this story, she'd been sleeping at the far end of the platform for 2 years, is not an exaggeration. 2 years is the kind of time in which the world can forget a person and remember a cat. It is enough time for the fabric of a life to fray and reweave. 2 years is enough to make a stranger into a fixture. There was a rhythm that the station had learned with her in it. Morning commuters who barely saw, late-nighters who occasionally left a coin, a watchman who would sweep around her like an official gesture of care. The staff at the ticket booth had a map in their heads, and she was a small dot. What made that night different was not that Maya saw the cat. It was that for the first time in a long while, someone else stopped too. A man standing on the opposite platform, older, with a gray beard that didn't sit at the jaw so much as drift away from it, had been watching the trains like they were portals. He was a man who looked like someone who had been permitted to watch a lot of things without needing to weigh in. He had a small package under his arm and wore a coat that was too thin for the rain. He stopped because his shoe had caught on a puddle, and he balanced himself, and in that balance he looked. He looked, and his glance folded into the cat's eyes and then settled on Maya. He was not a dramatic figure. He did not approach. He did not ask a question. He simply stopped, as if the very act of halting had allowed something to breathe that had been paused. That stop was small and ordinary, but like every ordinary thing it could have been an instruction, a promise that someone else had noticed. That night Maya got closer than she had before because the night had a certain permission. The rain blurred boundaries in a way that felt honest. When she moved, the cat did not bolt. She moved with the patient, careful motions that animals learn when they live around people who sometimes give them kindness and sometimes do not. She walked in a path that suggested a rhythm. Ears forward, tail low, steps measured. She looked at Maya for a long time, then flicked her attention to a darker spot by the ticket machine. Maya, on impulse, stepped toward the dark patch. There, tucked near the shadow of a bench, lay a small scrap of blue cloth. It was frayed along one edge, perhaps once part of a scarf, perhaps nothing at all. The cat sniffed at it and then, with a gentleness that felt like a confession, brushed it with her nose and sat down. Maya reached for the cloth and felt the same metallic tug she felt when she found a photograph that no longer fit in the frame of her life. She understood, in the way you understand a face you have seen once and now see again, that this small animal had a whole private interior that was much more complicated than the platform would admit. The cat had been there long, enough to become weathered, to store patterns in her muscle and jaw. The city had poured its small cruelties and kindnesses into her like a slow rain. When Maya left that night, she did not take the cloth. She folded it gently where it lay and touched the cat's small head with the back of her fingers. The cat closed her eyes the way a person might close a letter when they are not ready to. Read the last line. There was a slight rise of breath, the smallest thing. Maya left with the rain in her hair and something small and private unstitched in her chest. The next night she came back. The cat sat in the same place. The watchman was there sweeping the same sweep. The station lights buzzed like a tired aquarium. Maya had made a decision she didn't name. It was not bold. It was small and tenacious. She carried a cup of coffee in a paper bag with a warmed croissant inside. She set it down, not at the cat's paws, but a few feet away, because sometimes animals prefer the illusion of control. The cat approached the croissant like someone who had been practicing for patience. She ate in small, precise bites. Sometimes she would pause between them, as if to catalog the world and make sure it had not changed. All of this, her careful appetite, her exact posture, the way her tail would thicken when a person made a sudden movement, was not theatrical. It was the grammar of a life that had learned to minimize itself for survival. It was the kind of quiet behavior that makes a stranger soft towards it. People who hurry through the station sometimes tell themselves that animals are merely reflex machines, but in small moments you learn otherwise. There are hours when animals speak plainly, and you listen because the sound is clearer than human speech. The cat, in those long 2 years, had learned to speak in halting phrases and careful gestures. Maya learned them too. She learned the cat's schedule. She learned which seat she liked and where she would retreat when the trains came with their bright and vindictive rush. She learned the way the cat's pupils dilated when a siren passed, and how they narrowed when the sun found the angle of the tiles in the afternoon. She began to leave small things that were not food. A scrap of yarn, a tiny paper heart someone had left at the cafe and she kept tucked in her apron. She left them as if leaving a note to someone who never answers. And each time the cat accepted or ignored them, Maya understood a little bit more of what it was to love something without expecting reciprocity. The platform, over time, stopped, feeling like an anonymous urban fixture. It took on the rhythm of a place that held a small covenant. Regulars adjusted their steps to avoid the cat. The janitor stopped sweeping in a circle around her, and a teenager started bringing cinnamon rolls on Sundays because he liked the way the cat's ears twitched at the smell. Maya's life, which had previously been an accordion folded so thin it barely made a sound, began to unfurl around this small orbit. She began to be late to close sometimes, staying to watch the cat take a nap in a slant of light. The nights she spent with the cat were the only hours when her chest unbent and became a breathing thing again. But the station had its own rules. Trains changed their timetables. Construction happens. City policies shift like weather. There were nights when the cat did not show up. Maya would hold her breath until a train passed and the platform cleared, and then watch for the familiar silhouette at the far end. Once, there was a week where the cat did not come at all. Maya kept watching. She asked the watchman if he had seen her. She asked the boy who came late at night with his skateboard. The watchman shrugged. He had his own small losses. The boy said he hadn't noticed and then felt ashamed. There was a small tide of anxiety that moved through Maya when the cat went missing, the way one feels when a person you count on does not return a call. The worry was not grand. It was persistent. It rounded the edges of her days until it became a shape against which she measured small kindnesses. The cat's presence had, without fireworks or overt gestures, become a mirror for the life Maya had stopped hoping for. To watch a creature wait somewhere day after day is to be reminded that patience is not a passive thing. It is an active staying. It is a salve and a threat. It promises continuity, but it also is a reminder of fragility. The cat was living in the station like an unanswered invitation. On the third month of Maya noticing, she found herself carrying an umbrella that she did not need because the weather was clear. She carried it because she had folded a small, reckless thought into the handle. What would it look like to bring the cat under the umbrella and walk her home? It was foolish, adorable, and impossible. She had never intended to be that person, who imagines other lives articulated by small domesticities. Yet there she was, mentally mapping a route. Cross 3 streets. Go past the laundromat that always smelled of lemon and wet cotton. Take the stairwell where the light flickered once. At the landing, arrive at an apartment where nothing echoed too loud. She never followed through. She never even tried. The thought was a sacrament, kept secret. A tiny seed of the ending was planted on a night when the rain came like gravel. Maya had been late at the cafe because the espresso machine had clogged and the line had been longer than the patience of the city. She'd opened the door and walked into a curtain of rain, and there at the far end of the platform the cat sat like a small commandment. Precise, drenched, indefatigable. The cat lifted her head and looked at Maya the way someone looks at a person who has been absent at their own funeral. Her look had a quality that was almost pleading and almost proud. It suggested that she had been waiting, and that waiting had become a kind of language. That night, a stranger finally stopped in a way that felt slightly different. He paused on the stairs between platforms, not just balancing but holding his place, as if deciding whether to interfere or not. He had the look of a person who had become used to thinking better of interfering, and then did it anyway. He was not determined. He was simply moved. He spoke no grand words. He took off his hat and said without theatricality, "She's been here a while." His voice carried the quality of someone not searching for a partner in conversation, just testing the solidity of a fact. The presence of that man mattered less because of who he was, and more because he was proof that the pattern of watching had not been limited to one person. When two people notice the same thing, it becomes harder for the world to keep denying it. It was a small, soft validation for Maya. Someone else saw the cat in the same way she had seen her, as an inhabitant with a history. When the man added, "You'd think someone would have taken her in," Maya felt a strange, cold bloom in her chest. It was not anger. It was grief that had a name she'd never spoken aloud. She thought of the people who had moved in and out of her life and of all the small sketches of care she had left in the world like breadcrumbs. The man had a story folded neatly into his paws. He tapped the package under his arm and said, "My sister used to feed strays. We had a rule, never name them so you don't get attached." There was something careful in his confession, like a person confessing an old habit. Maya looked at him and understood without needing more. They were both people who had ways of managing their heart. They were both people who had found themselves softened by a small, persistent creature. That night, because the rain was loud and the trains were late, Maya stayed until the last possible departure and watched the cat press herself up against the strand of platform that kept her from the rails. Her breath came in slow, fogged puffs that dissolved into the night. The cat did not move. She did not seem to expect rescue. She simply occupied the space she had chosen. It was then, in the geometry of the platform and the rain and the man who had stopped on the stairs, that something began. The beginning was not explosive. It was not even loud. It was the sort of start that feels almost like a small confession. Two people noticing a thing and allowing themselves to be tender about it. Maya walked home that night with rain in her hair and the suggestion of a plan, though she did not call it that. She thought of the cat waking at the same tile the next morning and felt the weight of the world relax by a small degree. The station, always an indifferent place, had, for a moment, become a held space. At home, she made a list of things she would do once she committed. It was a ridiculous list by daylight terms. Buy a carrier, call the vet, spread the word online, ask around. The list was not action so much as permission. Permission to care. Permission is a strange currency. People who have practiced solitude, for a time, often need permission to re-enter the messy economy of attachment. The act of writing the list, folding it, slipping it into the mug she kept by the sink, felt almost ceremonial. It was a talisman she did not know she needed. She did not realize then how dangerous hope could be if it declared itself too early. Hope insists on narrative, on cause and effect, on rescue arcs and finality. The cat had lived 2 years in the seams of the station. The city did not always grant neat endings. 2 years creates habits. Habits are not always easily unstitched. Yet something, infinitesimally small and human, had shifted in the station that night. A stranger had stopped. A list had been made. A person carrying a chipped mug had decided, silently, that she might try to make room for another small life. The last moment of part 1 is soft and quietly decisive. Maya stood at the corner of her street. The rain washed clean off the world, and looked at the path that led to the station. The city around her hummed in the rhythm of things that do not change much. But in the thin place between one heartbeat and the next, something had begun to unspool. A small act of attention had taken root. A life that had been folded into a platform's rhythm now had a human who had allowed herself to care. She did not know then what would come. She did not know the ways the cat's past would ripple into the present, the people she would meet, the small, private losses that would be repaired by the measure of a warm body lying near her at night. She did not know that the stranger's stop would one day become the thing that unloosed a different kind of kindness. All she had was the feeling of having been noticed in return. And that is the beginning of everything that follows. You're here listening. And that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. She began to show up at the station with intention. Not grand intention. Not the kind that rewrites calendars. Just the sort that lives in small, steady choices. 1 extra minute before the cafe closed, the careful folding of a paper bag, the way she would tuck her phone deep in her pocket so the screen's light didn't flicker across the tiles. Maya learned the cat's hours. It started as a guess and then became a map. The cat arrived just after the 3 o'clock commuter rush eased, always, as if she timed herself to the thin seam between people going home and people beginning to sleep. She appeared in the same place, at the far end of the platform, like a punctuation mark on a long, tired sentence. Days warmed into the rhythm of repetition. The city did not notice much. The trains tracked their old metal hymns. The station's advertisements peeled in small corners. But the corner where the cat slept altered as if a quiet moon had pulled water. People began to notice her the way people notice a small curve in a familiar face. The watchman adjusted his sweeping. The teenager with the skateboard slowed his roll to drop a cinnamon roll now and then. The ticket agent stopped pinching her bills on the same day she saw the cat blink slowly at the evening light and decided to bring in a blanket folded like an offering. Maya's attention to the cat was not showy. It was domestic. She brought a thermos of milk sometimes, and coffee, and pieces of pastry wrapped in napkins. She learned what the cat liked: croissant flaky at the edge, no bitter coffee, a single mouthful of tuna when the animal seemed particularly thin. The cat did not accept everything. She declined quick handouts that made her feel rushed. She corrected the timing of kindnesses with a feline politeness that felt like an ordinance. Come near, watch, assess, accept if the mood allowed. She noticed the smallest things, the way the cat blinked slowly, twice, like an apology. The way her ears tracked sound and then sank when the trains came trampling through like thunder. How she would tuck her paws under like an anchor when a breeze carried a smell of burnt toast from the cafe. How she would lightly press one cheek to the edge of a step and then fold herself into the tile as if station stone were a soft bed. These behaviors became the grammar of their days together. In the beginning, Maya watched from a distance. She used the bench 2 seats away to keep the illusion that she was a passerby. She did not want to alarm the cat. The first few nights the animal would glance in her direction, measuring the weight of the human presence, then return to the rituals of her platform life. Sometimes she would rise and weave nearer, then half turn away, tail a careful semaphore. The slow blinks became a private form of conversation. Maya started blinking back, as if in a small theater where only 2 had tickets. There is a particular lesson in letting someone decide when they want you. It gives the relationship a sturdier spine. Maya learned to be patient. She learned to carry kindness like a small instrument you do not play loud. It taught her humility. The world had not been generous to her in obvious ways. She had been trained by a lifetime of small betrayals to not expect enormous salvations. The cat, by contrast, taught her that softness still exists in the world, and that you can practice it like a muscle. Weeks became months that did not advertise themselves. The seasons were not dramatic at the station. They pirouetted through the same dull palette. A winter came and the platform froze the same way houses do, settled. The breath of people suddenly visible, the tiles bright and sharp. The cat adapted. She acquired a thicker coat. She shifted her schedule to take advantage of midday sunspots when they happened. Maya began bringing a scratch blanket draped over her arm, the kind you fold in the back of a car. The blanket smelled faintly of lavender because Maya liked lavender and believed in small, domestic illusions. The cat's habits were not random artifacts of city life. They were patterns heavy with meaning. She would sometimes stand and lead a small circuit of the platform, nose to each tile, as if marking territory not for aggression but for orientation. She would disappear at odd hours, gone for a night, 2 nights, sometimes a small week, and then return as if nothing at all had happened, with a precise limp or a small grime patch that suggested an encounter somewhere that required an explanation. When she returned, she sometimes brought things: a ribbon, a scrap of paper with ink smudged across it. The objects were never grand. They were the debris of an unknown life, trimmed and left like letters without envelopes. Maya watched those returns with a particular hunger, because uncertainty had been her constant companion for a long time. She had learned to survive without closure. But the cat brought back small, material clues that made each absence into a story. A feather suggested birds in a nearby courtyard. A ribbon suggested someone who had been generous and then gone. The objects were not necessarily tokens to be decoded with certainty. They were openings. They let Maya build a narrative where once there had been blank space. At night, when the platform was mostly quiet, The cat's breathing became a metronome for Maya's thoughts. She would sit with her knees drawn and the city's light pooling, in the puddles, and the cat would sleep the way a person sleeps when they have surrendered a small, private sorrow. It was work to watch another being lie down and trust for the first time, to see armor loosen. Watching that, Maya found herself allowing tiny relaxations in the places she had kept tight. She began to sleep earlier sometimes. She found a softness taking root at the edges of her days. The human small talk around the cat evolved into quieter, more honest conversations. The man who had stopped that first night, the man with the gray beard, started showing up now and then. He didn't come to perform kindness. He came with a pair of gloves and a slow way of talking. He told stories that fit the station like old scarves. His stories were not about the cat at first. They were about his sister's dog, about trains in other cities, about the way the smell of rain used to mean something else to him. But slowly, the cat became a character in those stories. Not because he wanted it to be, but because the animal's presence made other things clear. One evening, the man sat beside Maya on the bench and said without looking, "She knows who's honest." It was a small sentence. It had no moralizing in it. It was a fact he had come to accept, Maya asked, not daring to be too immediate. "How do you know?" He shrugged, the motion small and resigned. "Animals pick honesty the way the city picks names. They don't care for our labels. They just know the shape of a person." They traded small confessions. Maya said she worked nights because it was quieter then. The man said he had been a teacher once, and he missed the routine. They began clocking each other's absences. If Maya missed a night, the man would remark, "A quiet you were missed," like a line of poetry in a newspaper column. If the man missed, Maya would worry. The cat was the hinge that allowed them both to practice neighborliness again. If there was an economy to repair in the city, it began in these tiny exchanges. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? The question came out of Maya in the middle of a winter Tuesday when the city felt smaller than usual. She had said it aloud without meaning to, and the man looked at her as if she had asked the most sensible, obvious thing. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes they just follow the sound of a heart. Sometimes they just don't want to be alone." Maya wanted to believe that. She also wanted proof. She had been witness to so many fragile things that had required proof to be believed. Friendships that dissolved without drama, kindnesses that evaporated when daylight arrived. So she waited. Patiently, practiced. The cat rewarded the patience in subtle, unmistakable ways. One night, she approached and sat just at the periphery of Maya's shadow. Not close enough to be presumptuous. Close enough to be noticed. She let Maya touch the top of her head. It was a second of contact, 2 fingers at the crown, and the cat's body responded like a chord struck perfectly. Her purr began as a small vibration and then deepened to something that felt like old bells. Maya felt the purr move up through her palm and into the soft bones of her wrist. It was a small miracle. She closed her eyes. The city, for that sliver, loosened its hold. That first touch. It mattered because it was given on the animal's terms. The cat accepted. She did not lean. She pressed her face into the warmth of Maya's hand, and then moved away just as quickly, like someone who has let you in, but only enough to be sure you won't break the door. The scene felt like a discovery of the sixth sense. Trust awarded, as if it were a small jewel. The bench where Maya and the man sat afterwards felt richer. From there, the relationship gained momentum, not by leaps, but by increments. The cat allowed Maya to stroke her back. She let Maya run her fingers along the length of her fur in the gap between trains. She permitted Maya to pick her up once briefly, like testing a new translation. The animal was not indulgent. She consented slowly, and in so doing, she taught Maya a practical lesson. Love can be patient and discreet, and sometimes the biggest movement in the world is the one you make by waiting. The station's other regulars noticed. A woman who worked late at a law firm started bringing tuna cans if she happened to be staying late. The teenager with the skateboard learned the exact distance at which the cat would allow an offering. The watchman, who had once been indifferent, now made a show of checking the blanket for the cat when he passed. The whole station adjusted quietly to the new gravity. When a community learns to care, it does so without ceremony. It becomes part of how the place breathes. Maya found herself wanting to take the cat home, in a way she had not anticipated. The thought was naive and domestic and heavy with implication. She pictured small mornings with sunlight on a shared mug, thick sweaters, tiny bowls on the floor. She pictured telling someone else the story of the cat and finding the memory warm in her palm like a stone. But she also knew, suddenly and deeply, that the cat had a geography she belonged to. The platform was not simply a place of neglect. It was a map of survival and belonging for this animal. It had edges and rules, and the cat had learned them. So, Maya respected that geography. She did not try to yank the cat from its habitat in a dramatic rescue. She offered slow invitations instead. She left blankets. She would sit longer. She would talk sometimes, because talking to someone else's pet is a way of saying otherwise difficult things aloud and watching whether they wilt or stand. The cat's response to these confessions was always measured. She listened as if she had always known the words, and now was archiving them. There were nights when the cat did not come, and Maya felt the old fear flicker like a guttering lamp. She would stand at the railing and look down the tracks and wonder whether some mechanical tragedy had finally unfurled. Each absence dissolved her control like water. She learned to cope by imagining an explanation that would allow the cat's return. She had made a friend. She was getting a full meal elsewhere. She'd found a nest of warmth. Each imagined consolation was a small story to keep the worry from hardening into panic. When the cat did return after those absences, she sometimes returned with a new detail. An unusual nick on her ear, a front paw scuffed, a fur patch missing. Each new mark was a reminder that street life had fought with her. Each return was also a proclamation. She had gone and come back. She had survived. The bond between Maya and the cat was not private in the way secrets are private. It was public and small. It fit in the station like a new bench or a posted notice. People started to claim a kind of ownership that was not possessive but affectionate. "Our cat," they would say, and it had a civic ring to it. It made the platform into more than transit. It made it into a place that allowed for tenderness. Maya took to writing small notes sometimes. Not notes that would circulate online or be dramatic, but tiny, anonymous scribbles like the kind people used to leave on community boards. One she left, pinned under the ticket machine with a small paperclip, read, "Thank you for staying." The next day, the watchman had added a post-it that said, in blocky letters, "She likes croissants." The dialogue between kind strangers felt like a repair. It made the station speak with multiple voices, all gentled by concern. The cat's trust deepened in ways only an intimate can notice. She would now choose the bench where Maya often sat, and give Maya a brief, almost ceremonial headbutt. It was an offering of reciprocal space. Maya learned that the cat liked the angle of the last sun of the day, and would always take up a particular tile when it warmed. She learned that the cat disliked quick movements and loud voices. She learned to be gentle in the way you are gentle, when holding someone who has been through hard things. One night in early spring, when the city was trying to wake up and yet still arrested by nights that kept cool, the cat made the smallest leap toward home. There was a stray of light that fell across the platform like a stage door. She lay in it and closed her eyes. Maya sat down beside her. The cat lifted her head, looked at Maya with a long, soft look, and then did something that spoke more loudly than any verbal pronouncement. She leaned, just once, and rested the side of her head against Maya's knee. The movement was minor in distance, major in meaning. It was not a full surrender. It was not a leap into captivity or surrender. But it was an invitation. It said, in the precise language of animal gestures, "I will permit you to be near me. Keep me. Watch me." This small lean was the shape of trust. It was the cat's way of allowing Maya across the boundary she had been guarding. Maya could not speak for a few seconds. She felt the cat's coarse fur like a map under her palm. The city's sounds gathered and then receded. Her breath steadied. She became aware of the smallness of a purr pressed into a human's lap, and how that sound can unclench a chest that has lived in discipline for years. The man with the gray beard watched from the other bench. He had a careful smile that had room in it for tears. He nodded once. It was the kind of nod that acknowledges that something important had happened. Other people on the platform even noticed. the way a rip in a curtain is noticed. A commuter gave a small smile. The watchman pretended not to look, but his hands steadied. Maya leaned forward and filled the moment by speaking quietly, because humans often fill silence with words to make sure the world knows they are present. "Hey there," she whispered, a ridiculous phrase in the face of such profound smallness. The cat blinked slowly. Her eyelids lowered and reopened like curtains drawn, and then reposed. That slow blink, that quiet blink, answered in the only way it should, with an agreement. The animal had said yes. It was a breakthrough small enough to be mistaken for nothing, powerful enough to change the axis of Maya's evenings. She left that night with her fingers smelling faintly of fur and food, and something in her chest rearranged. She walked home thinking of the cat sleeping on a tile, and the image of the animal's head on her knee played like a private film inside her. It made the city seem kinder by degrees. The breakthrough did not resolve the larger questions. It did not mean the cat would come home with Maya the next day. It did not mean she would stay always. It simply made what was already tender between them more real. It put a plaque of confirmation on the small belief that had been growing in Maya since that first rainy night. That attention, if given enough and given well, yields its own currency. In letting the cat decide how close she wanted to be, Maya had practiced a rare art. She had waited for consent. She had been rewarded by trust. It was a gentle reciprocity, like learning to tilt your cup so the other one can fill the last drop. That night, when the cat rested her head briefly, she did a kindness Maya had not expected to receive. She made the possibility of a future small and imaginable. She made the thought of bringing her a blanket to sleep in less like theft and more like invitation. Part 2 closes with that breach of distance. The station returned to its low hum. The trains kept their rhythm. But two people and one small animal had forged a quiet covenant. The cat would, in the coming days, test the boundaries further. She would come closer sometimes. She would vanish again sometimes. She would bring gifts and scars and secrets. The next steps would not be easy. They would be measured, awkward, honest. But on that bench, with the city breathing around them, the lean against Maya's knee was enough to define the shape of what might come. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? She began to bring things, small things at first. Harmless debris, a damp feather, a strip of ribbon caught in the wind, a plastic cap from a bottle. Maya noticed them because she had taken the habit of looking. When you pay attention to a single creature for long enough, your eyes begin to collect its details like a curio cabinet. You learn where the animals keep their stories. At first the objects felt like ordinary scraps. The ribbon was green and frayed at one end. The feather looked like it had come from a pigeon surprised mid-flight. Maya would find them near the cat's sleeping tile, left in a neat line as if someone had placed each item beside the other, and then stepped away. The cat herself would sometimes sit and watch her, head cocked, as if to say, "Do you see? Do you understand?" The ritual of return was always the same. The cat would vanish for a night or two. The city, which is its own kind of forgetfulness, kept moving. When she came back, she would appear in the early evening, as if she had made time to freshen herself before the public could see. She would drop the thing and sit back, expectant. The thing was not offered in the way of a beggar. It was offered in the way of someone leaving a message. And Maya, who had learned to read small gestures as if they were directions, read them. When the ribbon arrived, she thought perhaps it belonged to someone who once brought a wrapped parcel. When the feather arrived, she imagined birds in a courtyard or a rooftop chase. But then the objects began to gather meaning the way months gather seasons. The items had a certain taste. They were all soft. A scrap of lace, a small amber bead from a bracelet, a tiny marble dinged on one side. It began to feel less like random scavenging and more like a language forming. Maya started cataloging them in her head. She did not want to take them home, because there was a superstition she carried, quiet and trivial. Do not disturb what a stray has chosen to keep. So she left them in place, sometimes rearranging them into an order that made sense to her own mind. The watchman noticed. He began to move them back into neat rows when his broom curved the edge of the bench. The teenager with the skateboard would sometimes stop and touch the prizes the cat had left. With a reverence he did not show his phone or his friends. The station itself adapted to this new ritual. The bench where the cat most often slept became a small altar. There was, under all this attention, the cat would vanish for longer stretches now. Once it had been one night, twice, 3 nights. Now it stretched into full weeks. Each return became more intense. The animal would come back with evidence of outside life, grime between her toes, a bent whisker, the occasional small scar like a badge. And in those returns, she would also bring more careful items. A child's mitten, a button from an old coat, a sliver of a photograph. It was the photograph that changed the quiet into a question that could not be ignored. Maya found it during a rainstorm. She had stayed late at the cafe. Work had been good in the small, steady way of nights that hum with a comfortable rhythm. The rain spat against the windows as she locked up. She carried 2 croissants because on rainy nights you give yourself small luxuries. The station glowed like a wet gem in the streetlight. The cat sat where she often did, steady as a lighthouse. By the bench lay a thin rectangle of paper, curled at the edges, dull with rain. At first, Maya thought it was a receipt. She picked it up with a finger, and her palm warmed as she realized it was a photograph. The image was old, the kind of silver gray that lifts the color from faces and makes time obvious. It had been taken on a bright day. A woman sat on a bench with a cat in her lap. Behind them, a station sign peered into the frame. The sign looked like the station, as if the photograph had been taken on this very platform. The woman was young then, her hair braided, her smile slightly crooked. The cat's face in the picture looked like the one under the awning, as if DNA itself had drawn the animal twice. Maya's fingers went cold. The photograph smelled faintly of rain and something else. Kerosene, maybe, or the library. Some old, lived-in smell. The cat watched her handle it as if she were the one who had left it. Then the cat pressed her face to the photograph and made a small, odd sound. A chirp between a purr and a mew. As if the animal recognized a memory and had no other language for the recognition. Questions accumulated like dust. Had the cat belonged to that woman? Had she been left? Was the photograph a marker of an old life the animal had lost? The station had always been a transient place. People come and go like seasons. The very idea that someone might have lost a life here, intentionally or by accident, felt like a wound that could reopen. Maya asked around. She described the photograph to the ticket agent and to the watchman. She showed the man with the gray beard when he came by, and he squinted, and then said, "You'd be surprised how many people leave a piece of themselves where they can't find it again." His comment was not dismissive. It was a small, tender acceptance of how diaspora works in a city. One day, the cat left something small that made Maya think of deliberate communication rather than random scavenging. A tiny folded note, tucked under the bench as carefully as if it had been placed by a hand. It had no words, only a crude drawing of a bench and a tiny heart. It had been drawn in a child's hand. Whoever had folded that note had the same quick, honest hand as someone who would fold a paper airplane. Well, the note sat in the bench's dry curve like a sign cunningly left in the open. The presence of the photograph and the note opened narrative doors in Maya's mind. She wanted to think of redemption arcs. She wanted the story to resolve into reunion. She wanted to be the person who finally took action and closed the loop. But the city does not always bow to the script of desire. Streets have a way of keeping you honest. You can wish, but reality will test you. So Maya began to do small detective work. She began with the obvious. She scanned the photograph every time she was in between shifts, trying to recognize someone. Sometimes she held it up to the light to see if there were writing in the margins. Nothing. The printing on the back had long faded. She asked people who had been around the station longer than she had. One older woman at a newsstand, who sold cigarettes and gossip in nearly equal portions, looked at the photograph and then at the cat, and then back at Maya with narrowed eyes. "I remember her," she said slowly. "Not sure of the name. She used to sit here years back. Left with a suitcase more than once." It was the kind of memory that was itself a half-truth. People remember what they can afford to remember. Maya felt the possibility of a real story like a thread under her nails. She followed it to other places. She asked in an online neighborhood group, though she loathed the idea of turning the cat's life into a post. The neighborhood posts were full of lost things, and found things, and angry cats of a different sort. Someone replied after 3 days with a comment. There was a girl, maybe 3 years ago, who used to come with a camera. She liked old stations. No name. A lead that was more a suggestion than evidence. Meanwhile, the cat continued her pattern of leaving things and leaving again. The gifts were like the stamps of a small geography. One night she left a bead with a hole the size of a needle. Another night a rusted key that fit nothing anyone in the station could find. There was always this sense of other hands at work. The cat, once a solitary resident of the platform, had become a courier ferrying fragments between unknown people and the public space of the station. Her disappearances grew more alarming. She had gone for a month. Maya's anxiety tightened into a dulling ache. There were nights when she stood under the station's awning and counted trains as if counting them could conjure a creature back into place. People would ask if she had been taken to a shelter. Maya would answer the way one answers a polite and impossible question. Maybe. There was a small, stubborn refusal in her words. If the animal had been taken, Maya wanted to be the one to find. Out where? When the cat finally returned after a month, she came back with a limp like a tiny punctuation point. Her paw had a raw spot, and she moved with care, as if each step was a negotiation. Yet she still carried a gift. It was the biggest thing she had brought yet. A small, cracked locket. It was heavy for its size, a brass thing dulled with age. The link that held it closed was brittle. Maya sat on the bench and turned it in her palm until the rain released the smell of old perfume from its crevices. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph and a lock of hair. The photograph was minuscule, taken long before Maya's time. It showed a woman's profile, the kind of portrait someone takes on a bright day to remember the softness of youth. The woman's smile in the tiny picture rode close to ferocity. Joyful, stubborn, not afraid to be seen. Maya's chest constricted at the intimacy of it. The hair was reddish, dried and pressed flat by decades. The locket had the quality of a private thing smuggled out of a life and proffered on the public bench like an offering. There was no name. There was only the weight and the suggestion that someone cared enough to keep a memory inside metal and hide it where a station animal could bring it back. Maya felt the old hunger there, the one that wants to tidy loose ends. She wanted to find the face in the tiny photograph. She traced the locket with the edge of her thumb and felt, for the first time since the photograph, less like an interloper and more like a witness. Then, 1 week later, the cat stopped coming. Not for a night, not for 2. She simply did not appear one evening and then the following, and then a whole long sweep of days. The station adjusted its rhythm the way a room adjusts when a lamp goes out. The watchman swept around the bench but left the line of small treasures intact as a kind of prayer. People asked where she had gone. The teenager with the skateboard posted a message on the community board. "Has anyone seen our cat?" He drew a small, eager cartoon of the animal and pinned it with a thumbtack. Maya's worry, tempered by months of practice, multiplied into something keen. The absence felt loud. The platform was quieter. The photograph, the locket, the ribbon, all of it lay in place like a sentence with its last word missing. Maya started to check the hours when she could. She sat at the cafe after closing, counted the trains, stilled her hands until they felt like clay. She left food each night, hoping the cat would return and eat from the same place. She left notes, small and human. "Hope you're okay. Be safe." The notes were ridiculous in the face of a city's indifference, but writing them made Maya feel less helpless. Days became a thin drumbeat. Then the cat returned in a manner that would have been comic if it weren't so heartbreaking. She came back with the locket hanging from a thread on her collar. She had found a collar somewhere. Attached to it was a tag with a tiny symbol, a star. No name. The addition of the collar meant someone else had touched her. The locket now felt like evidence that the cat had crossed from one life to another. She seemed different, more watchful, more quick to retreat. Her trust felt tempered by something new. Maya tried to follow the trail. She watched where the cat moved when she left the platform. She waited to see which stairwell the cat preferred. Once, she trailed at a distance as the cat slipped through a gate and into an alley lined with tenements. Maya stayed in the shadow, heart ricocheting, and watched the cat slip into a dark doorway. A woman stepped out, small, with knitted hair, and scooped the cat up in her arms. The woman spoke to her like someone speaking to an old friend. Maya held her breath. The woman's tone was neither defensive nor hostile. It was matter-of-fact. "You're not from here," Maya heard the woman say, to the cat. Then she turned and looked right at Maya. Her eyes had an odd recognition. For a second, Maya wondered if she had seen this woman before in the photographs and notes. The woman did not speak the language Maya expected. Her accent had that soft baggage of someone who had come from somewhere else. She tucked the cat into her coat like a secret and closed the door. Maya wanted to knock. She wanted to demand a name, a story. She did none of those things. She stood outside the doorway and felt the weight of being a person whose story had, for the moment, nothing to do with this other person's life. The alley closed its mouth and left her with the question, who owns a life like this, animals? Who decides? She asked the watchman if he knew the woman. "We all know each other in the ways we need to," he said, shrugging. It was a small, impossible answer. But the truth was more complicated. People in a city love each other in discreet ways. They watch, they feed. They do not always reveal the details of their mutual care. Part of living in an urban place is learning to respect that. Then, on a gray morning when the station smelled of water and fried dough, the cat came back and did something that made Maya's breath forget rhythm. She walked to the exact tile, where Maya always kept her cup, and sat down. She had a prize between her teeth. A key, not a rusty random key. A small brass key, polished by hands, with a tag attached. The tag had a single, written number. It was not a full address. It was a number like a code. Maya pocketed the key the way a person pockets a compass. She felt the metal cold and alive. The tag's number pulled at a curious private muscle in her, at the part that wants to solve things. The number could have meant anything. A locker, a mailbox, a flat, a secret box anywhere. Whatever it was, the cat had carried it across streets, and trains, and into Maya's hands. At this point, it was no longer only about the animal. It had become about the life that wrapped around it. The woman in the photograph, the knitted neighbor who scooped the cat into her coat, the anonymous person who had given a collar with a star. The cat had become a carrier of histories, some active, some dormant, and her movements traced the margins of a community that existed in parallel to the commuter rush. Maya began to do something she had never done before, for something that was not entirely hers. She followed leads. She climbed the same stairwell the cat used until she found a door with a mail slot that had the same number as the tag. She knocked. Nothing. She waited. A boy with a bicycle peered out a second-floor window and saw her, and then closed the curtains. Nobody claimed the key. The smallness of the refusal was a different sort of cruelty. She tried calling the number she had seen scribbled on a flyer taped to a lamppost. The flyer had a phone number that, when dialed, led to nothing but static. She left messages with neighbors, with local businesses. She left a note in the cafe's window. "If you know anything, please tell us." It felt futile. But it also felt right. There are times a person must do a thing because otherwise they have given up on the world's small compasses. The cat continued delivering curiosities. One night she returned with a whittled wooden toy in her mouth, the kind children make in A Slow Summer. It had initials carved into the side. Maya turned the letters with a careful thumb and felt a hollow tighten inside her. The initials were the same as the ones on the tiny photograph in the locket. Two letters that matched in a way that felt like the arc of a story being laid down one careful stitch at a time. The coincidence felt like fate if fate wore gloves, and folded itself neatly into a bench. "Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest?" That question surfaced again for Maya. Not as a philosophical exercise this time, but as an urgent plea. She wanted the animal to be a sign of human connection. Proof that someone had left not as a wound, but as an exile that could be reversed. She wanted to believe that the cat was not merely scavenging, but choosing to ferry these artifacts back to the public place where other people might notice and respond. When the cat's routine shifted in a way that frightened her, Maya felt her chest jam with the effort of it. It happened one evening in late autumn. The trains had been delayed, and the platform was crowded with the weary and the cold. The cat had always preferred thin crowds, an audience without pressure. That night she came and then walked away before she reached the bench. She moved through the crowd with the certain gait of a creature who knows where to weave and when to keep shoulders low. She slipped beneath a commuter's coat and then under the high door of the arriving train in a way that made Maya's brain freeze. Maya watched her go through the train doors, watched the carriage swallow her. She thought that perhaps this was no accident, that the animal had found a reason to ride. She ran alongside the train a second before it left the platform. Breath, stinging cold, heart-knocking, violent and ridiculous. Doors slid closed. The train pulled away. She could do nothing but stand there like a person watching a world leave. The cat did not return that night, nor the next. The watchman called it a train, perhaps, and the teenager cursed the transit system under his breath. Maya's worry became the weather again. It drew lines and made nights smaller. And then it happened. She came back 3 days later, not at the platform, but on Maya's front stoop. Maya woke because the cat's mew cut through the small architecture of her sleep. She opened her door half drowned with the smell of coffee and lemon and found the animal sitting like a punctuation mark, eyes bright and the locket heavy at her collar. Her paw was bandaged. Someone had wrapped it in an old handkerchief, crude and clumsy. Maya took the cat in her arms. She felt the pulse in the little body. It was a small, shaky thing, but she was there, alive, and trusting. The way the cat had arrived on Maya's stoop felt like a change in the rules. The station had been her geography. The stoop was a private marker. It suggested that the cat had redefined her borders. She had moved from public to private. She had crossed a line that felt intimate. Maya felt honored and alarmed at once. She did not know what had happened on the train. She did not know who had tended the paw. She did not know whether the cat had been carried by a stranger's good hands or had been stolen for a reason she could not imagine. She looked for tracks of explanation, footprints, receipts, a stray hair on the scarf, but found only the solid warmth of a living animal in her lap. The bandage smelled faintly of camphor. It was a small sensory clue that pointed somewhere but not clearly. She decided to leave the locket where it had fallen under the bench at the station, because she felt a superstition. If the place where the story began could still hold its record, then perhaps the world could be nudged back into its proper sequence. Yet the cat's crossing into her private space had shifted everything. It had made possibilities bloom like bulbs in a neglected garden. That small thing, being carried to her door, felt like an invitation and a warning. That night she dreamed of tracks. Tracks that led from the platform, down into a grid of alleys and stairwells, to a basement room full of photographs. She woke with her throat tight and tasted metal, impatience. She had been summoned by the narrative and felt the pull to respond. The change was not just physical. The cat's behavior altered in ways that made Maya pull back into observation, like a diver tensing for depth. She became more cautious. She no longer sat at the exact bench when she came to the station. She chose the edges, the safe angles. She was more alert to the passage of strangers. She refused a biscuit from a little girl who flung it in her direction, and instead took it from the hand of a woman who had patience in her fingers. Sometimes, when the bench was empty of people, the cat would place her small things in a line that led away from the platform toward the city's underbelly. It bothered Maya to see them there, as if the animal were trying to map her exits. The items formed a breadcrumb trail that made her think of children and games and of rituals older than any of them. Leave an offering and something will show up in return. Then, more tangibly alarming, the cat began to wait by the southbound platform, the one the trains took toward the older neighborhoods of the city, the neighborhoods with courtyards and laundry strung like banners. She began to show up an hour before the trains of that line arrived, a tiny patient sentinel, and she did so more often than seemed natural. It suggested that she was expecting someone, or something. The pattern felt too deliberate to be casual. Maya started to watch those trains like a person watching for a child who might return from school with a scar or a story. She stood with her coat tight and her hands hollowed around a cup, waiting to see who stepped off the carriage that the cat seemed to seek. People poured out, tired commuters, a woman juggling grocery bags, a man with a thick briefcase, and no one matched the private contour that the cat waited for. Each failure tightened the ache in Maya's chest. One evening the cat did something that made Maya run, breathless and ridiculous and bright with fear. The animal leapt onto the platform, darted between legs, and chased after a woman who had just disembarked. It chased not to harm, but to follow. The woman only noticed when the cat pressed herself against her ankles. She looked around, startled, then down, then toward the sound of Maya's heavy shoes coming up the stairs. The woman was older than the faces in the photographs had suggested. Her cheeks carried weather. Her hands smelled of soap, and her coat had a small tear at the hem that had been mended with a patch. When Maya reached them, the woman knelt and picked the cat up. She kissed the top of the animal's head in a human gesture that felt like a benediction. Then she did something more astonishing. She opened the locket that hung on the cat's collar and whispered a name, soft and unpronounced, like something retrieved from a deep drawer. Maya braced for a revelation. She wanted an explanation. The woman looked at Maya with eyes that were both kind and hardened by memory. She did not speak in the city's common tongue easily. Her voice carried an accent that made the syllables feel like small imported things, foreign, treasured, slightly brittle. "She remembers," the woman said, and then added in English, with an edge of apology and the bluntness of someone who has lived by a harder grammar. "She remembers where she belongs sometimes." That sentence landed with a strange pressure. It suggested that the animal had a claim to a life beyond the platform. It suggested a story with other people in it. The woman smiled then, a quick, small thing, and then rose and walked away with the cat tucked into her coat like a child. Maya was left standing on the platform with her breath gone thin, her hands empty. The woman's movement pulled a line through the story. It was both a relief and an escalation. It said that the cat's life was stitched to other lives, and those lives would not be interrupted by Maya's tenderness alone. The cat's routines had shifted. She once belonged to a public bench. Now she belonged to a network of streets and people and names. She had begun to move between domains the way a person might travel between jobs, part-time in the warm community of the platform, part-time in the private exchanges of an older woman with a patch sewn on her coat. Maya's emotions were all over the place. She was relieved that someone else seemed to care. She was jealous of the intimacy shared by the woman and the cat. She was frightened that the line she had been part of, those small human gestures of food and blankets, might no longer be necessary. The city had given the cat another orbit. Maya had to reconcile with being one of many keepers, one of many people whose lives the animal brushed against. And yet the most unsettling change was something quieter. The cat stopped bringing little things in neat rows. She stopped leaving tokens that led backward into memory. Instead, she began to leave them at the edge of the platform, arranged not toward Maya's bench, but toward the stairwell that led away from the station and toward the older neighborhoods. It was as if she were mapping a route that excluded Maya's apartment. It made Maya feel both chosen and left out, like a person invited to a party and then told the guest list was full. The cliffhanger arrived in a small, ordinary way. One morning, Maya walked to the platform early before the world woke and found an object that did not fit, a child's shoe, leather scuffed and small, sitting precisely on the tile where the cat usually placed her treasures. Beside the shoe lay a soggy, folded bit of paper. Maya picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded it. There was a single sentence written, in a hurried scrawl, that made her read and reread it until the words stuck like a splinter. "I'll be back when I can." That sentence was not signed. It held no explanation. It could mean anything and everything. It was a promise and an excuse. It was the kind of sentence you write when you cannot stay and must leave someone to hold a space in your absence. The cat did not appear that day, or the next. The little shoe remained as a punctuation mark on the bench. People passed and then looked away. The watchman shook his head and said nothing. The man with the gray beard muttered a prayer into his coat. Maya sat on the bench with the shoe in her lap for hours, pressing her thumb into the worn leather until the print of her skin blended with the mark of the shoe. She understood in the small, necessary way of people who must reckon with absence that the cat's geography had shifted and that the story would no longer be a gentle arc that resolved into a tidy rescue. The animal was connected to people who had reasons to leave and reasons to return, and those reasons would not bend politely to the narrative Maya wanted to write. And then, that evening, as the sun pulled a slow curtain across the city, Maya noticed the cat walking along the far platform. She watched her like a person watching the moon, and felt an odd lightness, until she saw the animal do something she had never seen before. She walked up to the edge of the track and did not sit on the tile where she always did. Instead, she stared down the line of rails and then turned and looked directly at Maya, long and unblinking, and then walked away toward the stairwell that led out of the station. The act was small, a choice, a rerouting, a movement that said, plainly, that she had chosen another route. Maya felt her chest go soft in a way that was both grief and an opening. She reached toward the platform with a step and then stopped. She did not know if she could follow. She did not know if she should. The city had a way of asking you to let go of small personal stories in favor of the larger communal ones. It asked for a kind of humility. The cat disappeared into the stairwell and out of sight. Maya waited at the top of the platform until the last passengers had left and the station hummed with its nocturnal electric life. She sat then, long enough for the last train to go, and felt the absence settle like a second person in the bench. When she left that night, she carried the shoe in her bag like a relic. She closed her door slowly and sat on her bed and pressed the shoe to her chest and tried to imagine the world the cat had traversed. Her imagination was a map with torn edges. She felt that the story was changing not into resolution but into an honest and difficult question. What do you do when a creature you love chooses a wider life than the one you can offer? The cliffhanger, when it arrived, was not loud. It was quiet and absolute. The cat's routine changed. She stopped being a fixture in the predictable slot of the platform. She had started to travel, to commute in her small way, to meet other people and collect other histories. She had begun to belong to more than one small circle. Maya sat with that fact like someone holding a fresh bruise. It hurt, and it might be the shape of something that would teach her how to hold love differently. She did not know, as she lay awake that night, whether the cat would return to the exact tile where she had first noticed her. She did not know if the locket would open again with a new name. She did not know if the shoe would be left at the bench forever, like an ultimatum. What she did know was this. The small life that had anchored her nights had changed its route, and in that change there was a door. Maya pressed her forehead to the pillow and listened for the cat's small voice in the city. She felt the shape of a question pressing on the next day. It was a question that would demand movement. It would require her to decide whether to step beyond the platform and into the stairwell of the city, following a creature whose language she had only begun to learn. Something had begun that could not be solved by simple kindness alone. The cat's vanishing acts and return with artifacts had shifted from curiosities into a map that led somewhere else. Maya's next step would not be only to care, she would have to act. And with that realization, Part 3 closes on its cliffhanger. The cat's routine had changed, and the next chapter of the story would require Maya to leave the bench she had waited on for so long, to follow tracks into the city's deeper places, and to confront whatever or whoever had been threading a life together through the platform. For years, she followed. It felt almost foolish when she first decided. It felt like a small, brave lie she told herself, so she could stop waiting on a bench and actually go somewhere. But the decision had a clarity to it the way a snapped twig has, sudden, crisp, and true. She left the cafe before dawn because quiet makes the body braver. The city was still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Steam rose from manhole covers like little ghosts. Streetlights pooled in puddles. Maya tucked the child's shoe into her coat pocket, the worn leather pressed flat against her ribs like a secret, and walked toward the stairwell the cat had used. The stairs smelled like laundry detergent and fried onions. They felt familiar and foreign at once. She recognized the geometry of their daily commute. But the stairwell's edges were now a map of someone else's errands. She moved slowly, because following a living animal is different from trailing a person. Animals have a logic we cannot always decode. They turn without announcing the reason. Maya had learned in the months of watching to be gentle in the presence of other beings' roots. At the first landing, a neighbor's window opened, and someone called, "You following her, huh?" A voice that had seen too many small dramas asked without malice. Maya nodded and was given no instruction. The neighbor smoked and closed the window again. People who live near transit learn not to interfere until the story becomes their story. For now, Maya was the one who had chosen to walk into the edges. She had a map in her head of where the cat had been seen. Alleys that smelled of stew, a locked courtyard with laundry lines like low-hung flags, a row of tenements whose stoops were filled with furniture that had been loved into surrender. She walked past a bakery that was just opening, the smell of yeast a sharp, warm arrow. A delivery truck threaded the street like an old friend. The city was waking in small increments. The cat was easier to find than she expected. She found her at the base of a courtyard that opened like a secret garden. The courtyard belonged to a cluster of apartments whose windows were mottled with sun and the ghosts of plants. It was the kind of place that held its history in the grout. Children used to play here, then grew up and left, then came back with babies. The cat sat on a low wall like a little sentry, her green eyes hooded with the slow vigilance of a creature who has been tasked with duties. She was not alone. An older woman stood a few feet away, hands folded around a mug that steamed softly. She wore a patched coat and a scarf that had once been elegant and now was practical. Her hair was silver and pulled back in a knot. When she saw Maya, she smiled with a face that had learned to be careful with its expressions. There was a recognition in her eyes that made Maya's heart stutter. "You followed," the woman said simply. Her accent had a warmth that suggested oceans and other languages. It was not the man's gray-bearded voice from the platform. It was not the teenager's streetwise mutterings. This voice belonged to a person who had lived with the weather and had learned to read it like a book. Maya held the shoe up like a confession. "Is she—" she began, and then stopped, because the question felt too large for the courtyard. "Is she yours?" The woman's mouth tightened, and then eased into something not quite a smile. "She is not just mine," she answered. "She is for the place, and for the missing." Her words were small and elliptical, and Maya had to lean in to catch them. The woman introduced herself as Anya. She did not give a last name. She didn't need to. In neighborhoods stitched from transient lives, first names are often enough. She had the kind of hands that told stories, thumbs thick from work, nails clean but pitted. She spoke as if the cat were an ordinary participant in a long conversation. "She comes and goes," Anya said, as if announcing the weather. "She remembers some doors better than others. She finds things people forget." She looked at the cat, and the cat shifted in a way you do when someone you trust makes a complicated statement, and you want to show accord. Maya's throat tightened. "We found a photograph, a locket, a shoe." She handed the shoe across the small space between them. Anya took it, turned it in her hands, and then placed it gently on the wall, as if setting a bird in its nest. Anya's eyes filled with a fog of memory. "That shoe," she said. "He was small once. He grew fast, and then the city grew faster." She touched the worn sole with a tenderness that made Maya's chest ache. "I used to sit on that bench. Once, before the forgetting got loud." The coat tugged at something under Maya's ribs. She wanted to be a person who could fix things. She wanted to be a person who could demand explanations and make a neat narrative of being the rescuer. But the city refuses that neatness. Instead, it asks for patience, for small care, for a willingness to be witness. "Where did you go?" Maya asked. It was a blunt question, and Anya's face folded as if she had received the wind. "I didn't go far," Anya said. "I had to leave for a while." She did not give the rest of the story on that patch of concrete. There are things about human lives, shame, fear, choices, that people hold like a fragile cup. They only give them away when the cup is not at risk of breaking. Maya felt both the ache of wanting more and the recognition that the woman's words were a gift. She sat down on the wall beside the cat, close enough to feel the steady, warm pulse of animal fur. The cat glanced at Maya, as if to measure how deeply she had followed. She did not look like she was owned. She looked like she belonged to a set of rituals that crossed private and public lines. Anya led Maya down a narrow passage into a building whose hallways smelled faintly of lemon and nostalgia. The stairwell was dim but clean. Someone swept, with a sense of duty. Anya unlocked a door with a key that clinked like small bells and opened to a room that felt suspended in memory. It was small, tidy in a way that had been lived into, Books stacked carefully, a kettle on a modest stove, photographs pinned like constellations across a wall. Maya felt the air change inside the room. It smelled of old paper and the faint sweetness of a life that tried to hold steady. On a small table sat a box. Inside were more photographs, the locket resting on top like the center of a tiny shrine. There were more tokens, a child's toy, a ribbon, a ticket stub. The room was a repository for fragments. It was a room where memory was curated like a museum for one. Anya poured tea and offered Maya a cup. The cat jumped to the table, nosed the locket, and then turned and pressed her head into Anya's palm. It was the gesture of a dedicated messenger reporting for duty. Anya closed her eyes and let the animal's touch settle across the bridge of her palm, like a benediction. "Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest?" Maya asked, because sometimes words ask for permission to be said aloud. Anya looked up, steady and present. "They know the shape of need," she said. "They do not judge the reach of it. They just go. They carry." Maya felt a sound well in her. It came from somewhere beneath her ribs and tasted like rain. She watched Anya arrange the photographs with a care that made each picture look like a relic. Each photo was a story compressed. Smiles, stations, faces blurry with time. In one, a young woman, hair braided, eyes bright, sat on a bench with the cat in her lap. That was the photograph Maya had found. "This was me," Anya said finally, and her voice made the room tilt. "I used to come here with a camera. I took pictures of people and told their stories. But then things happened I could not tell my camera." She paused. Her hands trembled, but steadied, the way hands do when a person is holding a truth that hurts them to speak. Maya felt the corner of 1,000 small sorrows press against her. She remembered the man with the gray beard, the watchman, the teenager. They were all parts of the same seam. "We had to move," Anya went on. "I had to go. I left things behind because the city asks too much sometimes. But she pointed at the cat with the same exact reverence Maya had reserved for holy objects. She remembered. Her voice broke like a small wave. "She carries what is lost. She takes it to the place where people will see it. She brings back the pieces when some of us cannot." Maya sat very still. The room orbited around the idea that the cat had been a courier of memory. She had been delivering relics to the public bench so someone would notice. Someone would ask questions. Someone would keep the record. The simplicity of it made the world feel both kinder and crueler at once. Anya told pieces of a story that fit together like a paper puzzle. She had been a photographer who documented the small joys and the quiet tragedies of her neighborhood. Someone had once gifted her the locket. It had belonged to a woman who had been the center of a network, a single mother, a neighbor, an aunt. Anya had left abruptly to tend to another life matter, to take care of a family member who had been ill. She had been away longer than she intended. Memory, the city's public and private memory, is fragile. It unravels when people disperse. Anya's absence had been one of those unpicking threads. "The cat was my way to stitch things back," Anya said. Her voice was small with the effort of confession. "I trained her, in a way. Not to fetch like a dog. Not like that. I taught her to carry small things back to the bench. Not every thing. The important things. Things that would tell where I'd been. Or who I was." Maya's breath snagged. The idea that this animal had been trained, deliberately, patiently, to retrieve and return relics reframed all the scraps the cat had left. They were not random at all. They were a ledger. Each feather, ribbon, bead had been chosen because it could point a line back to people who mattered. The cat was not merely a fixture. She was a bridge. Anya's eyes shone with memory. Sometimes, when I was gone, I would teach her a place to take a token, a bench, a coin, a photograph. I would leave a small object, half to map my route and half to say, "I will come back." The bench remembers. The people notice. Some of them help. Some of them do not. But the bench, someone watches it. It keeps our story. Maya's hands were restless. She thought of the torn note. "I'll be back when I can." She thought of the locket and its small hair. She thought of the child's initials carved into a toy. The room arranged them into a logic of loss and love. The cat was a citizen in a community of remembering. Anya reached for a photograph and slid it across the table to Maya. It was of a young boy, dark hair falling into his forehead, holding the cat like a trophy and laughing. The photograph breathed the smell of childhood, chalk dust, pocket change, the roughness of small knees. Maya felt a wind blow through her like an answer she had not earned. "That boy is my son," Anya said softly. "I had to go. He was taken, or maybe he left. It's not that simple. The city is full of complicated things, but she touched the cat's head, and the cat leaned in and then pushed its cheek into Anya's hand, as if agreeing. She remembers him. She remembers the song of this place." Tears rose in Maya's eyes. She pressed the heels of her hands into them, trying to steady herself. The room pulsated with a hush that felt like a prayer. She had not expected a solution. She had not expected the story to be so admirably messy and true. But the cat's role as carrier of fragments suddenly made everything coherent. "You taught her to keep memory alive," Maya said, because the sentence felt like a key. It allowed a door to open in her chest. Anya smiled then. A small, rueful thing. "Not exactly. She taught herself too. Animals learn the things we do not teach them. But yes, I tried. I would leave something with her and tell her where to take it. I would point. She would do the rest. Sometimes she would find a bench, sometimes a person, sometimes a woman with a patched coat who was good at keeping things. She nodded toward the wall of photographs. Sometimes people would take the message and run with it. Sometimes they would do nothing. But it always mattered." The revelation settled at Maya like a new garment. She felt its weight and wonder, and also a pinch of indignation. How had she not seen this? How many other small lives carried the city's buried stories? She felt like she had been given a second sight. Anya stood and retrieved a small box from a shelf. Inside, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, were names written on slips of paper and small trinkets sorted as if in a curio shop. She handed Maya one of the slips, a name, a date, a short, messy phone number. "We keep these here," Anya said. "For those who search." Maya read the name and the date and felt the ground rearrange. The name matched the initials on the carved toy. The date corresponded to a weekend when Maya had been certain the cat had disappeared, and her worry had grown like a knot. Evidence and memory aligned in a sudden, fragile geometry. She thought of the watchman, sweeping in loops that hid his tenderness. She thought of the gray-bearded man who had paused at the platform and of the teenager who brought cinnamon rolls. They were all part of a distributed network of people who, in their small ways, had kept the bench's ledger of lives. The cat had been the thread pulling them together. "You stayed because of her," Anya said. "Because the bench waits." Maya felt the ache in her chest sharpen into resolve. It was not the kind of resolution that makes a neat ending. It was the kind that calls a person into action. She wanted to find the boy in the photograph. She wanted to understand what had made a woman leave and promise to come back when she could. She wanted to be part of the work of keeping the ledger alive. She looked at the cat then, the animal's gaze fixed on her with the calm, unhurried focus of a creature that has been on a mission. For a moment, Maya felt as if the cat had known she would come. That small electric tickle of destiny washed through her. She felt less like a rescuer and more like a chosen witness. "Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest?" Maya asked herself again, quieter now. The answer in that room was undeniable. They do. They do not fix everything. They simply know how to carry. Anya opened a drawer and took out a small, trembling notebook. Inside were notes in a cramped hand, addresses, names, small sketches of benches where things could be left. It read like a map for people who have nowhere else to put their hearts. She handed the notebook to Maya and said, "If you want, keep it. The bench needs eyes." Maya accepted the book like an inheritance. Her fingers trembled. It was heavy, with the weight of stories. She thought, with a clarity that pricked honesty into her bones, that she would not walk away. They spoke for a long time after that. Anya told stories of nights when the cat would find a mother who had misplaced keys, or a young man who had dropped a letter. She told of times when the cat brought photographs that made someone cry and then call an old friend. The cat had been, in these stories, not simply a pet, but a civic instrument of repair, a thing that made people remember that the world contains connections if you know where to look. The emotional peak of the scene arrived not by grand confession, but by a small domestic moment. Anya rose, walked to a shelf, and returned with a wooden box sealed with a simple clasp. She opened it. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a string. The paper smelled of years, and the patient yellow of stored things. The letters were labeled with names, a system that made sense only if you had lived in their logic. She handed one to Maya. It was addressed to a boy whose initials matched the carved toy. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate, someone writing a promise in the only way possible. Maya's hands shook as she read, "I will be back when I can. I am trying to be brave. Keep my place. Love. A." The letter was not a legal document. It was a human thing, uncertain, flawed, honest. It contained no guarantee. It did not require one. It required only the witness of being read. Maya closed her eyes and let the room breathe. When she opened them, Anya met her gaze and said, "She has always been trying to keep the promise. She kept it in the way an animal can. Without words, she kept the bench warm." Maya felt a sob building in the depth of her chest. It rose like water, inevitable and clear. She let it out then, a wet, astonished sound that had no performative quality to it. Her hands went to her mouth. Her breath quickened. Her whole body shuddered with the force of an old, unspent grief finally loosed. Anya did not flinch. She reached out and took Maya's hand with a practicality that blunted the rawness into a sane shape. "It's okay," Anya said. "We will do this together." The cat hopped onto Maya's lap as if invited. Her small body fit like the missing piece of a puzzle. Maya's hands hovered above the animal's back, then settled. The cat's fur was rough in places and soft in others. She tilted her head, caught Maya's palm, and then pressed her forehead into it. It was the gesture Maya had been waiting for without knowing it. The cat's head against her hand was a compressed apology and an offering of trust. It held 1,000 tiny things. The knowledge that many hands had fed her, the memory of the bench that had been home, the wear of the streets she had crossed, the small compass of her life. Maya's tears came then in a flood that felt like permission. She pressed her hand harder to the cat's head, feeling the rapid, steady beat of animal life. Her other hand rose and touched Anya's until their fingers met like two people stitching a seam. The urge to speak clear resolutions ebbed. What mattered was the presence between them. The proof was in the small warmth they shared in that dim room. Tea cooling, photographs breathing, a cat's head heavy in a stuffed palm. That pressure, the cat pressing into Maya's palm, was the emotional pivot. It collapsed years of absence into a single, tender understanding. The cat had been a courier of keepsakes because she could not speak the human language, and because sometimes the only way to ask for help is to carry the proof to where someone will notice. She had been the thing that kept a promise alive. Maya's hands trembled. She felt the gravity of the moment. The bench had been a hub. Anya had been an origin. The cat had been the carrier. She realized the thing she had thought she might own, the cat, was actually a public good. It belonged to a broader geography, of people who maintained memory like a public library. Her instinct to rescue the creature by bringing her home was not wrong, but it was incomplete. To honor what the cat had been doing, she would have to ask permission to enter that distributed life. She would have to become one of the many hands. The realization made the room expand. It offered a new, quieter purpose. Not to take the cat away, but to keep her in the loop. To help patch the holes that had made Anya leave. To look for the boy in the photograph. To keep the bench warm. Outside, the city continued its daily insistence. Inside, the room had become a small command center for a slow civil rescue. Action would not look like a headline. It would look like phone calls, letters, a visit to a social office, a mapping of names. It would look like being patient enough to wait for the right doors to open. It would look like holding small things and watching the way the world rearranged itself around them. Maya rose and stood in the light slipping through the curtained window. The cat pressed her head the tiniest bit harder into Maya's palm. An affirmation. For the first time since she had noticed the animal 2 years earlier, Maya felt the story make sense. She felt the knot in her chest untie into threads that her hands could work with. She left the room with the notebook in her bag and the letter in her pocket. She kept one hand on the cat's small back as she rose, because the contact made the promise real. Outside the courtyard, the city smelled of lemon and the street vendors' frying oil. The station's rhythm called like a familiar song. As she stepped back into the morning, the cat followed, moving fluidly, certain as if she had rehearsed this route 1,000 times. Maya kept pace. She moved through the stairwell like a person who had been given a new map. She knew now that rescue was not always the dramatic extraction she had imagined. Sometimes it was the slow knitting, finding the person who had left a remit in a photograph, tracing the boy's name, arranging a visit, offering to keep the bench warm until someone else could take the role. At the platform, people noticed the woman and the cat, and the exchange of the locket. The teenager with the skateboard gave Maya a look that acknowledged the new covenant. The watchman cleared his throat like someone making a small announcement. "We're helping," he said, as if he had been saying it for years. Maya sat down, on the bench. The cat jumped into her lap and made that small, contented purr that vibrates from the chest. She pressed her head into Maya's palm again, hard enough that Maya felt the little hum against her bones. The gesture said more than language could. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for seeing. Thank you for being part of the ledger we keep in." That pressure, in the quiet, the emotional summit broke open like light through a shuttered room. Maya understood the full truth that had been waiting in the cat's small, persistent acts. This animal had been keeping tabs on memory, carrying evidence of lives that refused to be erased by absence. She had been training herself to be a bridge. The gifts, the ribbons, the toys, they were all signposts, not random trash. They were invitations to reconnect. Maya's hands trembled, her chest loosened. She cried again, but the sound carried a new currency, a commitment. The cat pressed her head into Maya's hand, and in that electric, unmistakable gesture of trust, Maya finally saw what the cat had been trying to tell her all along. The morning, after the meeting in Anya's room, felt like after the first rain of spring. The city had washed itself clean in ways that simply made room. Maya woke with her hands smelling faintly of paper and tea, and the notebook heavy in her bag. She kept the letter folded in her pocket like a promise. She moved differently now, not bravely, not loudly, quietly, as if she had been taught a new way to breathe. The cat followed her to the station that day, and sat in the same sun slice she'd always chosen. She looked at Maya with the patient, knowing eyes of an animal who has been carrying more than anyone realized. Maya sat down on the bench and opened the notebook. The pages were a ledger of small hopes. Names, dates, partial addresses, the kind of details that become maps when people know how to read them. The first days were practical. Phone calls, 2 a day, a morning spent at the municipal records office, tracing a name. An afternoon texting the teenager who rode his skateboard like it was a second skin. A week of knocking on doors in buildings whose stairwells smelled of frying oil and soap. She learned how to move without looking like she was chasing ghosts. She learned how to ask questions that didn't push people away. The station's community tightened in a soft way. People who once only nodded at each other began to speak. The watchman cleared his throat before announcing small updates to anyone who would listen. The gray-bearded man handed Maya a list of numbers he jotted on a napkin. The teenager made a flyer, careful and a little embarrassed, and taped it to the corkboard, where lost things were always pinned. A photo from a neighborhood social group, a name, an old sketch of a boy. These acts were small. They had no press, release. They had no grand headline. That is the thing about repair. It is mostly made of small gestures done repeatedly. Anya and Maya made a plan. Not a plan with a triumphant conclusion, but a plan with steps. They would gather the names. They would call shelters. They would visit a social office and ask for any records. They would speak to the people who had been in the photographs. They would check storage boxes. They would, quietly, hold a space for possibility. Maya found she liked the work. It fit her like a pair of soft gloves. She liked the precision of It. The city revealed its kindness in sudden, surprising places. A postal worker remembered the name on the old locket and sent a text. A woman from a local church recognized the initials and offered a box of old letters. Someone who used to sell toys at a weekend market remembered the carved initials on the wooden toy and led Maya to a tiny workshop where a man kept a ledger of custom carvings. The ledger led to a name. It was faint. It had been recorded in the slanted handwriting of someone who liked lists. It matched the initials on the toy and the date on the letter. It was one of those small, unlikely connections that in a story would play like a neat deus ex machina. In real life, it played like a single real door opening. The man at the workshop said he had made the toy for a boy years ago, and then, quieter. He used to come with his mother. She wore a scarf like that, the one with little stitches. I remember because she asked if I could carve the initials. Small. She'd laugh then like the world had fewer teeth than it proved later. His words were not a complete arc. They were a piece. Pieces were the work. They stitched into something else when many people held them. It took time. It needed patience. It needed a network of small hands. It needed people who would be stubborn about memory. One afternoon, as autumn leaned toward winter with the air thin and sharp, Maya got a message on her phone. The gray-bearded man had found someone. He had been speaking with an old friend at a bus depot who remembered a woman who had left town in a hurry. The friend gave him a name and a street. The exchange felt like a relay race in the dark. The baton passed hands, and finally, someone could see the finish line. They went together. Anya, Maya, the watchman, the teenager, the gray-bearded man. They moved as a small crew of people who had agreed not to look away. The stoop where they knocked was simple and sagging and had a mailbox that hung like a promise. A woman opened the door. She was older, her hair silver like Anya's, and in her hands she held a cup of tea. The woman's face held the familiar private sadness that comes with surviving. They introduced themselves with soft, cautious voices. The woman listened, and as she did, the street seemed to lean in. She asked to sit. She took the locket and the photograph and held them like a map. "I remember him," she said after a long time. "He was small. He loved marbles. He chased sparrows. He called me Teda because my mother used to call me that." Her voice twisted into a laugh that was also a sob. "He left to find work. He wrote once. Then he didn't. Cities take people sometimes." Maya felt the floor tilt. The woman's name was a small lock. When she read it aloud, softly, like a spell, the air in Maya's chest rearranged. The name matched the entries in Anya's notebook. It lined up with the carved initials. This was not a tidy return. It was a conversation that had been waiting for three hands to meet. It took all of them to make that connection. The next weeks were a slow unraveling. Paper forms filed. A social worker called. A message sent to a number that, against odds, someone answered. A voice on the line that at first said nothing, then said faintly, "I'm here." When they all met for the first time, the small circle, at the station, arranged like a crude altar, Maya held her breath. The woman with the patched coat and the boy in the photograph stood across from each other. He was older now, shoulders narrower than he had been in childhood images, eyes that had been hardened by traveling. His hands were rough but steady. He looked like someone who had learned to carry things quietly. There was no traffic of words at first. There were only long pauses in the city's normal noises. A train in the distance, a newsstand selling papers, a child laughing a city laugh. Then the boy recognized the locket in Anya's hands. His face shifted. It was as if he had been struck by something tender and terrible at once. He breathed in. The sound was small and human, and then he said, "That was mine." The sound cracked, the air into pieces. The woman, the boy's aunt it turned out, breathed out in a noise that was both relief and grief. The watchman had his hand pressed to his mouth. The teenager's eyes were wet without dramatic flourish. They sat then, on the bench that had been their altar, and told stories. The boy spoke haltingly. He told them of a hard road, dangerous corners, nights with the wrong people, work that took him far from where he grew up. He told them of a winter when he had nowhere to sleep, and a stranger had given him a day job that turned into a month of more stable work. He told them he had meant to come back, But then a phone call, and then more calls, and then a series of small emergencies that pulled him from the map. "I left a note once," he said, voice thin. "I thought I would come back. But the world kept asking for more pieces of me, and I gave the pieces away until I had nothing left to come back with." There were no dramatic confessions beyond that. He did not demand forgiveness, nor did he beg for absolution. He offered what he had, a set of facts and an apology that smelled like honesty. Anya held his hand. The cat wound between their legs and pressed her head where her palm landed. For a moment, the world seemed to settle. The reunion was not a television spectacle. It was small and honest. There were tears, yes. But mostly there was the slow, awkward work of two people trying to resume a shape of life that had been interrupted. They talked about practical things. The boy needed a place to sleep. He needed paperwork. He needed someone to vouch that he was not a ghost. The watchman promised to help with identification. The teenager offered work at his father's garage. Maya offered a space, small and temporary, where the boy could leave a bag. There was a quiet exchange. Then that meant more than words. The boy took the locket in his hand and opened it. He put the small photograph of his younger self next to Anya's photograph, and then held them both like a tether. He looked up and then leaned in to kiss Anya's cheek. Not a dramatic embrace, but a practical, human return. The city breathed around them as if it too were relieved. That night, after the paperwork and the tea and a framed photograph propped in a corner like a new star, the boy slept in a small room arranged for him by volunteers from the neighborhood. He woke with the city's light in his face and, for the first time in a long while, had a place to keep the carved toy. He set it on the windowsill like something that deserved an altar. Maya watched all of this with a tenderness that felt like a new language. She was not the hero of any headline. She was one of many hands. She had, however, learned something that changed the shape of her days. She had learned how to hold space. The cat kept doing what cats do. She slept in the sunslice, chased shadows, brought small curiosities. But now those curiosities had faces and addresses. They were the dialect of a neighborhood learning to remember. Maya's life softened in ways she did not expect. She began to wake earlier, not because she had to, but because she wanted to watch the light. She started bringing home small bakery fragments to keep on the counter. Her apartment, which had once been a neat archive of solitary things, acquired little signs of other lives. A pile of children's drawings taped to the fridge, a tiny bowl for the cat set by the windowsill. She took to boiling water for tea and leaving the kettle on low because sometimes people dropped by with news and needed warmth. Sleep came easier. The nights no longer held the same acid edge of loneliness. It wasn't that everything was fixed. It was that the world had rearranged just enough to give her a softer margin. The cat continued to come and go. She still vanished for stretches. She still carried ribbons and trinkets and sometimes the occasional odd key. She never fully relocated. She had two geographies now, the platform and the courtyards, the public bench and the private rooms. She wore the collar with the star like a quiet medal, and she always came back. The final gift arrived in a day that smelled like rain and dust. It was small and simple. The boy, whose name was now known, whose life had been resumed in modest human ways, came to the bench with a box. He handed it to Maya with a clumsy, hands-first manner. "Anya told me to give this to you," he said. "Said you kept the watch." Maya opened the box. Inside lay a photograph she had never seen before. It was of Anya, much younger, leaning against a post at the station, the cat in her lap. But this photograph had a difference. In the corner, a small shadow of someone else, a child's laugh caught on film, the boy, younger and half hidden. Behind them, the bench, the locket, a world young with possibility. There was also, tucked beneath the photo, a key. Not the small brass key that had once been a code. This key was new. It fit into her palm like a secret. On it, a tiny tag read, "For when you need to open a place that keeps letters." "For you," the boy said. "For the bench. For keeping things safe. We wanted you to have it." Maya felt the world tilt. The key was a permission and a trust. It was small and ordinary and enormous at once. It handed her the authority to tend a small archive, to be a steward of memory for a place that had given her back so much. Anya's eyes shone as the boy explained. A small community locker had been rented, a place where letters and photographs could be stored, where people could leave tokens for others to find. They had pooled money and time to secure it. They wanted it to be a public thing, a small civic trust. In handing the key to Maya, they were inviting her to be the steward. The responsibility sat like a stone in Maya's palm. She felt it sink and then settle into a comfortable warmth. It felt right. The future locker became a small room of relics. People left things there, a pair of mittens, a photograph, a note. Sometimes a mother would come and leave a drawing. Sometimes an old man would slide in a folded newspaper clipping. It became a place where memory had somewhere to live. The cat would sometimes sleep on the locker when the sun hit it. She guarded, yet in the way she guarded the bench, as if both were part of the same small covenant. Life did not become perfect. The city still had its hard edges. People still left. Money still worried shoulders. But something larger had shifted. The neighborhood had learned to keep a ledger. People looked at each other differently because they had been taught by the acts of a few to notice the less visible parts of the world. Maya found her nights gentler. She found her smiles easier. She found that her chest no longer contracted at small silences. She found, too, that being part of the ledger made her feel like part of an old, tender story. The bench had not only been a place where the cat waited, it had been the hinge between private grief and public tenderness. One afternoon, months into the slow repair, the cat performed a small, absurd gift. She trotted up with a wet scrap of paper in her mouth. Maya took it and unfolded it. It was a tiny drawing, childlike and earnest. The station, a bench, a cat with a star collar, and a small stick figure labeled, "Thank you." It was the kind of thing you only get after work has been done and the world has decided to notice. Maya kept that drawing on the fridge. She looked at it sometimes the way people look at old stamps, tiny, precious, evidence of a larger journey. There were other small gifts. Anya gave Maya a tin box embossed with flowers. Inside she kept letters and receipts and a copy of the photograph where the boy sat as a child. The boy himself occasionally stopped by with a bag of pastries. The gray-bearded man taught Maya how to make a small repair to the bench when its slat splintered. The cat? She kept doing what she had always done. She continued to show up sometimes, for a day, sometimes for a week. She always came back to sleep in the same sun slice. She always, when she wanted, would press her forehead into Maya's palm. It was a gesture that meant, "I belong to this place, and I trust you with its story." Maya learned to accept that some loves are porous. They do not ask for full ownership. They ask only that you keep a seat at the table. She gave the cat a bed, in her apartment sometimes, but she never kept her there as one would keep a souvenir. She knew this animal needed to move between places. She was a bridge. She had been built by the neighborhood itself. Months later, on an evening when the light made the platform look like a film set, Anya sat on the bench and told Maya something small and sharp. "You were the one who kept showing up," she said. "That is how these things live. People who keep coming are the ones who stitch." Maya didn't know what to say. She had no pride in the kind of way that demands certificates. Instead, she had a deep relief. She had become part of something larger than herself. She had learned how to be quietly useful. The final gift, the closing tender thing that would sit in the story like a polished stone, arrived not as a spectacle, but as an ordinary miracle. The boy, whose life had been scattered by circumstance and then reknit by small hands, brought with him, one slow afternoon, a potted plant. He handed it to Maya with both hands. "For the bench," he said, and explained that he had found the plant in a spot where someone had been throwing things away, and he'd rescued it and nursed it in a windowsill until it lived. It was a small thing, but it signified tending. They planted it at the base of the bench. The plant, green and stubborn, grew, and in a season gathered a small ring of people who watered it. Children drew chalk hearts around it. The cat slept, in the sun above, and the locker key jingled in Maya's pocket when she walked past. What the cat had done, in the end, was not simply to ferry relics. She had shown a city how to keep its promises small and persistent. She had taught people That memory could be cultivated like a garden, if only the right hands took care of it. She had taught them that rescue is often a shared recipe. A dash of attention here, a pinch of paperwork there, a cup of kindness stirred into daily routine. Maya's nights were softer. She made tea and left the kettle on for the boy, and for neighbors who might stumble by. She kept a small bowl of milk in the cupboard for the cat. She found that giving had a return other than gratitude. It made her chest less lonely. It made the noises of the city less sharp. It made her realize that belonging is a verb you practice. At the very end, the cat gave the simplest, final gift of all. One morning she came to the bench and, with the solemnity of a small priest returning a relic, laid down a new object. It was not much. A smooth pebble, gray and ordinary, warmed by the sun. On its side was a tiny etching. Someone's hand had scratched a small heart into the surface. Maya picked it up, and the pebble fit between her fingers like a promise. She understood then that the cat's greatest gift had not been the reunion, nor the letters, nor the key. It had been the lesson of steadiness. The animal had taught a group of strangers how to notice. She had taught them to keep small things safe. She had reminded them that the city contains spaces where the quiet work of care can be done, if people will look. Maya carried the pebble home and placed it on her kitchen windowsill. It sat there like a small sun. When she touched it, she remembered the cat's head in her palm, the locket opened, the boy's awkward apology, the locker key cold in her hand. All those pieces were proof of what can happen when people keep showing up. The station remained a place of departures and arrivals. The trains still kept their indifferent rhythm. But the bench now had a ring of people who would notice when a shoe appeared, when a letter was tucked under a slat, when a kitten needed a blanket. The cat moved in and out of lives like a small composer orchestrating a city's memory. And Maya kept going back. She kept bringing croissants. She kept the notebook updated. She became the person who would stand a little longer in the rain because someone might need a hand. She had been given a key, and she used it to open a locker where letters lived. She had been given a photograph, and she framed it and propped it on the shelf. She had been given a place where she belonged. That place had no headline and no anniversary. It had instead a steady hum of small acts. The universal thing she learned, what the cat taught without ever needing to speak, was this: trust does not arrive all at once. It grows like moss in the cracks where people leave something gentle behind. Trust is small. It is repeatable. It is boring and radical at once. In the end, the final gift was not an object. It was a weather shift in the human heart. The bench was warmer. The late hours were softer. The city, in one tiny corner, had learned to return itself a little. When the story closed, the cat sat in the sun, eyes slowly closing. Maya sat on the bench and reached out. The cat lifted her head and pressed the side of it to Maya's palm. It was the same gesture that had broken open months before, and then, and again, and again. It spoke a language without words. Thank you. We are here. Maya pressed her hand down, and the cat leaned in harder. The action was small. It was ordinary. It was everything. The last thing the listener should know is a truth as plain as breath. Lives change by small things. Returning a letter. Leaving a bench warm. Showing up. These are the economies of trust. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.